we were talking about his mother's family and how they were plantation owners. That's interesting with what's going to be happening in his youth, in his teenage years. The Civil War was not part of his growing up. It's something that happened during his teenage years, his really young rebel sort of years. His mother's family were the plantation owners. They owned a big plantation in Henry County, close to Griffin, Georgia. And his uncle, Jonathan Mackey at that time, his uncle he was the largest slave owner in that part of Georgia. Mm-hmm. So this slave plantation mentality was part of his upbringing. Yes. In fact, when the Civil War came along, all of the men in his family signed up to go fight for the Confederacy, and one of his aunt's husband was a state senator, and he was one of the signers of the Articles of Secession that started the Civil War. And if you read those Articles of Secession, very clearly states, they say this is why we're going to go to war, because we need to preserve our economy, and this is our economy. So it was a known fact in his family that slavery was part of the story, and that his family was going to go fight for the war, and then he's left at home. He's a boy surrounded by all the women in the family. And I just think that's got to have made him an interesting character there. And you think of all the young boys who got left home, when all the men are going to go fight for something that you've been raised to think is right, and he can't. So how do you think his family's involvement in, and just the Civil War in general, how did that impact his personality growing up?
Oh, I don't think there's anything less than profoundly. He was able to see things. His father had been, Henry had been, had served in the Mexican War, and had actually brought home an orphan child.
Francisco Hidalgo.
Francis Hidalgo.
When Henry was still a bachelor, and he brought this boy home with him. So Francisco was he 11, 13 years older maybe than John Henry?
When they brought him home.
So they weren't contemporaries, but there was this, for a while, this boy living in his home.
But, and he brought, and of course he brought home some, like a lot of folks did from Texas, and he brought home pecan seed.
And stories of the Mexican War.
And stories about the Mexican War, and so he had that, and he had that military bearing, and so I think that he was doubtlessly heard stories his father told over the years, and there was also the fact that there was a training facility for the Confederates
in his hometown of Griffin, Georgia.
In his hometown of Griffin, and he could watch these soldiers training, so he was getting a bird's eye view of it, and he lost what was probably his best friend immediately when Tom Mackey,
who was his uncle, but very close to his age.
But probably I would say that Tom was probably the closest member to the Doc of either side of the family.
Really more like an older brother.
Yeah, like an older brother, because he had lived for a time, with the
Holiday family.
With the Holiday families there, and so all of the Mackeys and the Holidays that were of age were involved in it. And now Henry had some difficulties, and that caused him to be discharged.
He had some medical problems.
Because of medical problems, and he came home. That was really a major concern, in particularly in Georgia, because disease became a serious problem. In fact, Tom Mackey was hospitalized for a lengthy period of time during the war. So, but he developed that martial air, and one of the things that, to go back to the southern traditions, he was already a person who was familiar with firearms.
People ask me all the time, in addition to where did he learn to play cards, where did Doc Holliday learn to shoot? Well, he's a Southern boy, for starters.
He's a Southern boy.
And his father was a military man.
and he hunted
right?
quail and dove and the deer and all those things as a boy.
They said that he was such a good shot that he could shoot the eyes out of a rabbit when it stopped to look at him before it started running again, which is amazing. So he's here now during the Civil War. Everybody's gone. His father's come home, and in fact, his father came home shortly before John Henry's grandfather passed away. And so now his father is the patriarch of this whole big family with a lot of women in it. And John Henry there. And there were privations in Georgia. You know, we think of just the battles being a problem, but food was scarce. You mentioned disease. Food was scarce. People were gone. The economy was being destroyed. And it was all being done to the South by the federal government. Do you think that had some impact on the way John Henry felt?
From their perspective, surely. I think that it's important to realize that Henry was smart enough, as he kept up with what was going on in the news. As you know, in those days, newspapers were one of the best sources of intelligence for either side, because there were so many stories about what was going to happen, but he realized that if Atlanta was going to be the target as a rail center, and that after leaving Atlanta, he pretty much predicted that he was going to the sea.
Well, and what happened?
Yeah.
You're talking about Sherman's march to the sea,
Sherman's
that he would
march.
come down and just take out Atlanta, and Sherman had said himself he was going to go from Atlanta to Savannah and leave a path a mile wide where a crow couldn't find its dinner. And Holiday family members said that's what happened. So Henry was smart, and he took his family and moved south.
Yes, he moved to the end of the railroad.
It really was. And Valdosta is about 4 miles north of the Florida border. And across the Florida border, we do have to mention Holiday's, 2 of his Mackey uncles established a plantation south of
in Hamilton
County, Florida. So the family all moved down there. And originally, the refugees in that area all thought that they would go home after the war ended.
After the war, yes.
But you know, you get someplace and you make friends and you build a house and you put in crops and you decide to stay.
Yes.
So then he grows up down there. And do you think that all of that he went through with his family had any impact on his feelings about authority or policing, any rebellious feelings about things?
That combines. He was an angry young man. That develops fairly early. You can see it in particularly in the years just after the war, that he was someone with a chip on his shoulder.
Mm-hmm. A huge chip called the war.
And he was a person that I think he was really troubled when the war ended. There's just a whole series of things that happened in a very brief period of time there during that.
Because the war didn't just end.
It didn't just end right there, because you know, there are stories. I don't know how. I've never been able to confirm them. That Doc actually went to look for his Uncle Tom, and when they found him, they moved. He took him on to Valdosta, and it's interesting that immediately we are into Reconstruction, and there's the heritage that Georgians, some of whom carry it to this day, about Sherman, you know, and all of this sort of thing.
And so people understand what Reconstruction was. This was martial law.
Martial law.
And Georgia had to be reconstructed, like the rest of the South, to be allowed full admittance back into the Union. They'd separated themselves from the country, to be able to come back in with all the rights of citizens, they had to obey a whole series of laws and ratify a lot of amendments to the Constitution. And Georgia would refuse to ratify these amendments, and then martial law would march back in. So there in Valdosta was a military post of Yankee soldiers. This is after the war. There's a military post there.
Well, the military post it was also that post was manned largely by black soldiers.
And that had to have been
And
an
that
issue.
that is adds to the resentments on the part of most of the Southern population.
Well, and we have to remember too what martial law meant. You have no rights. Martial law means you're run by the army.
The army tells you what to do. Yes.
Yeah, and so here they come out of the war, these hot-headed young men. So one of the stories that we have about Doc Holliday, and it's a story that was told around town. We don't have proof of his involvement, but it gives you certainly an idea of what the tenor of the times was the courthouse bombing.
That is an interesting story, and one that I think there's still more out there to learn about it. But essentially, a pro-Reconstruction politician
He's
by
a
the name of
carpetbagger.
a carpetbagger
Come.
named Clift came to town, and he gave a speech, was going to give a speech at the courthouse without getting permission from the local authorities to give an address. He was hoping to run for office. And
So he's a Yankee is the point. He's
yes,
a Yankee politician come down
Yeah.
to speak to these Southerners.
yes.
They weren't
And so-
happy to have him.
So what happened was that at the gathering, there was an explosion, and fortunately nobody was injured, but apparently a group of teenage boys, there are probably 7 or 8 of them all together, had gotten together, and you know, they weren't out to, they didn't know who was going to be there. Mostly it was freedmen, but there were also a lot of curious people that were just curious about what was being said. But you know, these boys were looking to blow up their relatives and their
They just
neighbors.
wanted to get the Yankees
They
out of town.
just wanted to get them out of town, so they had this explosion. It was described as a bomb with a modicum of powder, so it wasn't a big, terrible thing.
They didn't know how to do a bomb
the
properly.
local authorities condemned it mightily right from the very beginning. But
And the boys, most of the boys were marched off to Savannah for a military trial.
Right.
And that's in the papers in Savannah.
Right.
And one name that's missing from that would be John Henry
Henry
Holliday.
Holliday.
And they were all his classmates. So this was his pals from the Valdosta Institute. And this would have been his social group. He could have been part of that. A family story was that his father got him out of town quick and sent him back up to North Georgia to stay with relatives in Jonesboro.
yeah, so that's when he goes to Jonesboro.
And who's in Jonesboro?
That's where he run. Another of the uncles, who
Robert Kennedy Holliday.
Robert Kennedy Holliday, and who is the father of
Martha Jane.
Martha Jane Holliday, better known as Maddie.
Maddie, John Henry's cousin. She's 18
Cousin.
months older than he is.
Yes.
She's the oldest sister in a family. He's an only son in his family.
Yep.
And they always said that she just took him under her wing and he adored her.
Yeah.
And so rumors that he was 16 at the time and
Right,
she was
something like
18.
that.
So the rumors that a romance began there.
Yes. But I have to mention a couple of other things that with respect to his attitude, because I think this is critical to developing, to seeing the emerging anger in John Henry. The one thing that happened very shortly after the war was there was an incident involving a black soldier and a local woman,
Oh, yes.
and they man by the name of Dick Force, who wasn't much more than a kid himself.
Yeah, just a young man.
Very, very young.
And another one of the young men who'd gone to that same school. So he also was part of that social group Holiday was part of.
And so Dick Force got into an altercation, and his arrest was ordered. And he had hidden out, but for some reason, they decided to throw a party. Some of his friends decided to throw a party, and they got word to Dick Force what they were going to do and where. And he shows up, and the army is there. They come after him, and they shoot Dick Force, and he's carried back and eventually dies of his wounds. So this is one here, and Dick Force was kind of a hero to his classmates because of his.
Yeah, they called him the captain because he was like the oldest of them, and he'd actually served for a little bit in the war,
Yeah.
so he was like the honorary oldest guy
Yeah.
there. And he died of gangrene or something after.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, after being shot down on the road. So how do those young men feel again about the authority over them?
You know, it's also true that another thing that did not sit well with Doc was the fact that Henry,
His father.
became the father, is appointed the head of the local Freedmen's Bureau, which was the organization that was supposed to help the newly freed slaves in their transition to citizenship.
Well, and one of the things that the white people of the South didn't like was that Freedmen's Bureau was overseeing the breaking up of the plantations. So the plantations were broken up and given out to the former slaves. And the Freedmen's Bureau was there to help assist in that.
Yeah.
Now, how Henry Holiday got the paying job to be in charge of that, we don't know, but it may have rankled his son that there's his father helping to tear apart the world that he knew.
Then not long after that, Doc's mother passes away in September of 1866. And this was a sensitive thing, and it's still sensitive when you talk to members of the family, is that at that time, Henry lived a little north of Valdosta, in the area of Bemis, on Cat Creek.
Right.
And he had a neighbor named Martin who had a young daughter,
Right. Rachel.
And it was customary for...
And Henry had an ailing wife. We got to let people know about Martha Jane, or Alice Jane Mackey. We don't know what she passed away from. Her obituary does not say. It just says it was a long and difficult illness. There's no family stories that say it could have been consumption, could have been cancer, could have been any number of things. But the point was, he'd had an ailing wife for some time, and who's living next door?
This young
Rachel
girl.
Martin.
And
When she passes.
But it was customary for there to be a mourning period.
2 years.
2 years.
For a husband
For
to
a
mourn
husband.
for a wife.
And I think even for a son, he was supposed to wear black for a year.
Right.
And
no social engagements,
no
deepest
social,
mourning.
that's right. But in December of 1866, just
Right.
a few months,
3 months later.
yeah, Henry marries Rachel Martin. And this drives a wedge between Henry Holiday and his son, John Henry.
Well, and between the whole family too.
And you can see, and the Mackey family that was living in the area. Plus, in 1867, there's that famous little confrontation that he had with a schoolmate, where apparently the schoolmate challenged him to a duel, and in effect, they're standing there, and they meet to have a duel, and the other boy brings dueling pistols, and Doc says, "I brought my own," and he said, "Well, this is just the other boy assumed that to be kind of just a pretend kind of sham deal."
And he shows up with a real pistol.
And he shows up with a loaded weapon and
Yeah.
says, and he says, we're these guns are not loaded. He said, mine is.
Yeah.
And basically, so he's got, you can see the building anger in him
Right.
all through that. Eventually, by the way, in '67, Henry was removed as from the Freedmen's Bureau job. So that was part of it.
Well, we talk about that wedge between not just John Henry but and his family too, because the Mackeys, his mother's family, were not happy when Henry dishonored their
Yes.
sister by quickly marrying this other girl. And John Henry had been set to receive an inheritance down from the Mackey family, and it was under Henry Holliday's guardianship, and so the Mackey family actually sued Henry Holliday to get the inheritance back, and that inheritance was a business building in Griffin, Georgia. The suit was brought down in Valdosta, and then the recording of it was also done up in Griffin, so we know what happened with that. But that's a big schism in a family, to have not just your mother pass away and your father marry somebody else, but now your mother's family suing your father's family because of all that's going on. So that's a big challenge. And you think about John Henry, and we didn't really talk about the fact that he was the only child. In my book, I call him the only son of the oldest son of a fine Southern family, primary heir to the family's good name. And we're going to ignore a phone call we're hearing ringing because we have Old West things to think about. So John Henry he's the only boy, and he is torn. He's half Mackey and he's half Holliday, and the two sides of his family are fighting, and he's lost his mother, and if ever a boy needed a tempering hand of a strong mother, it was this boy.
Yeah.
And she even left her written testimony for him so that he could look back and see what things did she believe. And it's interesting that she had left one denomination for another because one church believed basically that if you did bad, you went straight to hell. And the other church believed that you could repent and be saved from things, and so she went with that one. Mm-hmm. And you have to wonder, was she already dealing with a bit of a rebellious boy his whole life? Was he tough to handle? And she needed to know that he had chances.
What she had done, and she had when she married, she began to attend the church of her husband, mm-hmm. and which was normal in those days. So there is that little.
And then in her obituary it says she left that because of the change in doctrine. But I just think it's interesting that doctrine relates to raising a boy who maybe needed lots of forgiveness in his life.
And Henry was a very stern man besides, but the combination of the death of his mother, mm-hmm. and the tensions of the
war and Reconstruction,
of the Reconstruction period, and the marriage drove a deep division between Doc and his favorite relatives. In some respect, it's not that he had close ties to the Hollidays. He maintained that because that was what you did when you were part of a family. But he was living close to the Mackeys.
The Mackeys were really his
Mackeys
family.
was his family most directly, and that shows up in the way that the conflict over the Iron Front building in Griffin.
That inheritance property played out.
Yeah.